So the only reason I can explain this stuff at the end of the day is wheat addiction. Now, these people are addicted to wheat. They just can't give it up. And this paper that's available free on the web, The Origins of Agriculture, a Biological Perspective and a New Hypothesis. And these scientists are hypothesizing. They're like, listen, wheat agriculture is damaging to the environment. It is backbreaking work for piss-poor nutrition. Why the hell did we do this? Why the hell did humanity adopt this? And the reason they come up with is like, it's addictive. This stuff is addictive. And here's something really interesting. So the ingestion of cereals and milk in normal modern dietary amounts by normal humans activates reward centers in the brain. Foods that were common in the diet before agriculture, such as fruits and so on, do not have this pharmacological property. The effects of exorphins are qualitatively the same as those produced by other opioid and or dopaminergic drugs. That is, reward, motivation, reduction, and anxiety, a sense of well-being, and perhaps even addiction. Right, so these people are proposing that wheat is addictive. And of course, you start doing a little bit of digging on this stuff, and like opioid peptides derived from wheat gluten, their isolation and characterization. And by opioid, the opioid receptors in the brain, poppy seeds, drugs, heroin. Right, we're talking about the same thing. So when people say get off the crack, get off the wheat, I mean, there's some truth to that. There's some people that are addicted to this stuff, and I've seen some people just dream about eating bread when you take it out of their diets. And there are other people that take out the grains and they get these huge severage symptoms. They get headaches and whatnot, and they were literally addicted to this stuff. There's plenty of papers on this. Gluten exorphin B5 stimulates prolactin secretion through opioid receptors located outside the blood-brain barrier. Demonstration of high opioid-like activity in isolated peptides from wheat gluten hydrolysates. So that is essentially my take on grains and legumes and why you should eliminate them from your diet. The next one is a gray area. We had a question for this in dairy and on the web, and I'll address it a little later. But we've covered why excess carbohydrate is good, why the anti-nutrients in the grains and the excess omega-6 in the grains and whatnot are bad for you. You can look up this document on the web. The web address is right here. The document is called Byproduct Feedstuffs in Dairy Cattle Diets in the Upper Midwest. And this is essentially a paper that is telling farmers how to feed crap to their cows. And this crap I have right here. So it's divided into sections, and one of them is high-fiber byproducts. And the high-fiber byproducts, you have beet pulp, brewers, dried grain, malt sprouts, soy hulls, wheat byproducts, corn, gluten, cotton seeds, distillers' dried grains, distillers' dry grains with solubles, distillers' well grains, hominy, which is just like corn bran German starch. And then you have the high-protein byproducts, which is canola meal, corn gluten, literally fed to cattle, cottonseed meal, linseed meal, soybean, sunflower. And then there's animal marine sources like blood meal, hydrolyzed feather meal. This is like from chicken processing. Fish meal, meat and bone meal, poultry byproducts, delicious. Bakery wastes, corn screenings, candy, fat, liquid whey, nuts, pasta, potato waste, snap bean cannery waste, soy case, starch, sunflower seeds, sweet corn cannery waste, vegetables and trims, peanut skins. Did anybody see grass on the list? No. Dairy cattle are, they're called herbivores. In French, herb means grass. They're meant to eat grass. They're not meant to eat grass seeds or any other things like that. They're meant to eat grass. So, we've seen that this stuff is bad, has a high omega-6 content, has anti-nutrients in it, has certain problematic proteins. So the question, of course, is, given this impressive list, is it not surprising that you're going to find that dairy consumption is associated with disease? And sure enough, you do. So the first thing that you notice is that high intake of milk, but not meat, increases insulin and insulin resistance in 8-year-old boys. The problem that I have with a lot of the research on dairy is that it's done with dairy that comes from grain-fed animals that just eat crap. And there's never a control. They never feed a control group dairy that comes from grass-fed animals to see if there's the same effect. So it's really hard for me to say yes or no, is this good or bad? There are certain interesting theories out there. We're going to cover one of them. But I don't know. Like, more research needs to be done on this. Some people who are still stuck on the whole insulin spiking theory of why carbohydrates is bad, which is not necessarily the case. High insulin levels are an effect of the metabolic syndrome cause, but it turns out that there is a pretty high insulinemic response to either skim milk or whole milk. So it turns out that the fat content of the milk isn't really important. It's the specific combination of proteins and carbohydrate in that milk that gives you this high insulin response. But again, that's not necessarily what causes the insulin resistance. And then there's also this leptin resistance paper from triglycerides. And if you look at the details, the triglycerides specifically come from milk. But then again, do you see the same triglyceride profile if the animal is fed properly? Because we know that if you feed an animal grass as opposed to grain, it completely changes the fat profile. Triglycerides are fat. So would this still be going on in an animal that was properly fed? I don't know. The stuff is not properly researched. One thing that seems somewhat legitimate, and that I'll cover, is this whole IGF-1 issue, insulin-like growth factor 1. For one thing, it turns out that milk that are injected with biosynthetic hormones, so recombinant bovine growth hormone, RBGH, have a lot more of something called insulin-like growth factor 1 in their milk. And that is very well known. And then this IGF-1 kind of switches what's called the IGF-1 axis, such that milk protein consumption induces postprandial hyperinsulinemia, we've covered that, and shifts the growth hormone insulin-like growth factor axis to permanently increase the IGF-1 serum levels. Insulin IGF-1 signaling is involved in the regulation of fetal growth, T-cell maturation in the thymus, linear growth, pathogenesis of acne, and this is a huge one. Someone who has acne, we almost consistently see that the elimination of dairy improves the condition. So there's something truly legitimate here. So acne, atherosclerosis, diabetes mellitus, obesity, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases, thus affecting most chronic diseases of Western civilized societies. Of special concern is the possibility that milk intake during pregnancy adversely affects the early fetal programming of the IGF-1 axis, which will influence health risks later in life. An accumulated body of evidence for the adverse effects of cow's milk consumption from fetal life to childhood, adolescence, adulthood, and senescence will be provided, which strengthens this presented hypothesis. So this isn't a journal that is medical hypothesis, and the stuff is really well referenced. It goes out and gets legitimate scientific evidence to support their claim, but it's still somewhat on the hypothetical side, even though it's pretty solid. But then you start looking at this stuff. This is the cover of Science magazine on April 6, 2007. And this is a Great Dane that's standing right next to a Chihuahua, right? And you can tell that one's like way much bigger than the other. And what's the difference? It turns out that the difference is all in the IGF-1 signaling, in the IGF-1. Right? So this Great Dane has a lifespan of about 5 to 7 human years, whereas the Chihuahua can live up to 20 years. So it looks like this IGF-1 signaling tells the body to grow older and not just bigger. So there's these people that are doing like the gallon of milk a day that are trying to put on muscle mass. I'm like, maybe not that detrimental if you're doing it for 1 month, but I cannot recommend that for lifelong consumption, right? Because not only is it telling you to grow bigger, it's telling you to grow older. It's accelerating the aging process to a certain extent. And there are mechanisms that are known for that, and that is legitimate. Another problem that people will bring up is that of casein, and I mentioned that earlier. So casein is a protein in milk. There's various flavors of it. What's important to note is that just like gluten, it contains a lot of proline amino acids in it, so it's pretty hard for your body to chop it up. And then there's this whole thing of A1 versus A2 milk. Has anybody heard about that? So it turns out that goats, sheep, and then cattle's, such as Journeys and Gurneys, produce a milk that has more A2 casein in it and a lot less A1 casein. And this A1 beta casein is a fairly problematic one as far as human digestion is concerned. It turns out, however, that all of the milk that we consume is made by Holsteins, and Holsteins produce A1. So there are plenty of societies. Some people may have heard of the Maasai. They're, I think... Oh man, I don't want to get this wrong. Exactly where they're from. It's somewhere in continents in Africa. What was that? Northern Nigeria. Okay. And traditionally, not anymore. They're eating mostly corn now. But traditionally, they would survive. They were pastoralists, and they would survive off of the blood, meat, and milk of their cattle and sheep. They figured out a way to tap the arteries of their animals and drink the blood. They don't do that anymore. But back when they were doing that, they were studied, and they had absolutely none of the diseases of Western civilization. So this thing that milk consumption is bad for you, maybe somewhat contradicted by that. But the problem is that's an observational study, right? That's an epidemiological study. So maybe there's other factors or other things that they were doing that explains that. I don't know. A little bit more on casein over here. So now, what about the milk of grass-fed animals? So the milk of grass-fed animals is an excellent source of something called conjugated linoleic acid. As I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a naturally occurring trans fat, and it's really, really healthy stuff. And if you look, the cows that are grazing pasture and receiving no supplemental feed have 500% more conjugated linoleic acid in their milk than cows that are fed a typical dairy diet, which is just grains and all kinds of other crap like that. And then conjugated linoleic acid in adipose tissue and risk of myocardial infarction, the higher the conjugated linoleic acid content of your adipose tissue, the lower your risk of having these problems. So, could it be that this is overriding any detrimental effects? Like I said, again, it's just such a gray area. It's hard to get good data on this. And I don't know. I can't recommend it at all. So the dairy is like a gray area. So where are we at after all of this? We covered the excess linoleic acid. We covered the excess carbohydrate, specifically fructose. So essentially, what I would recommend to use, eat meat, vegetables, tubers, some fruit, nuts and seeds, and then eliminate grains, legumes, and dairy. Is there, there's so many diet plans out there. Is there a diet plan that more or less resembles this? And yeah, there is. It's called the Paleo diet. And it's called the Paleo diet because it relies on the Paleolithic era. So essentially anything that was widely available 10,000 to 15,000 years ago, prior to the advent of agriculture, you can eat. If it's after the advent of agriculture, you cannot eat. So that means you can eat meat, fowl, fish, and seafood, eggs, assuming there's no autoimmune disease, vegetables, animal fats and oils, roots, tubers, and bulbs, nuts and seeds, and fruit. But you should avoid most foods that have become widely available since the advent of agriculture. And this includes all grains, grain-like substances, cereals and pseudo-cereals, all variable, legumes, peanuts, soy, beans, all that things, alfalfa, peas, and dairy products. I have a huge issue with this stuff. The dietary recommendations that we're going to come to at the end of this are not all that different. They will be slightly with respect to which foods you should emphasize, but the whole emphasis on the date really bothers me. You have people in between blogs that are arguing about whether or not potatoes are paleo. And I just really? Seriously? It's just well, the potatoes have this saponin in the skin. Yeah, just remove the frickin' skin. It's as if humanity could not have discovered a better food prior to 10,000, 15,000 years ago or after that. And that notion is ridiculous to me. Hey, I'll readily admit that our record is pretty piss poor as far as inventing new foods is concerned, right? But just because it became widely available after 10,000 to 15,000 years ago doesn't necessarily mean that you shouldn't eat it. And the whole potato thing is it really makes my blood boil. I mean, sweet potatoes have oxalic acid in them. They have goitrogens in them, so if you eat it raw, it's bad for you. If you cook it, those things are neutralized. Cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, kale and whatnot, they also have goitrogens in them, but they're neutralized if you cook them. Soy has goitrogens in them, but those goitrogens, by the way, affect the thyroid in a bad way. Soy has goitrogens in it, and that's not destroyed by cooking. It is somewhat eliminated by fermentation. Actually, it might not be. Don't quote me on that. So like I said, plants are trying to defend themselves. There's going to be something in there that's bad for you. And this whole thing about arguing, is this paleo or is this not paleo? Because, this food comes from this period and that one comes. I just, give me a break. Grow up. Seriously, grow up. And this turns more into religion than anything else. I think I've showed you sufficient scientific evidence to support why you should eat this specific way. You don't need that to tell you how you should eat. And just because a caveman did it doesn't mean that you should do it. Because everybody in here should realize that's an observational study. If you look at a modern hunter-gatherer population, or if you look at, or try to estimate what our ancient ancestors were eating, and you say, well, they were healthy, hence, this diet gives you this outcome. You cannot do that. That is an observational study. You need randomized, controlled trials to prove whether or not that is the case. It's another thing that really, really bothers me. Some of the researchers that are in this field kind of go about the science in the wrong way. They go at it the same way that Ansel Keys did. They assume they were right. They look at what the caveman and the modern hunter-gatherers did. They assume it was right. And then they do the research to support their claims. And what are you when you do that? You're a biased researcher. And this stuff really pisses me off. So I try as much as possible to distance myself from this whole caveman bullshit. I really just cannot deal with it. I really don't like it. And this emphasis on the date just drives me mad. It's just unnecessary. I mean, there are some interesting things about that. You look at what we're eating nowadays, and it turns out that refined sugars, refined vegetables, oils, grains, and dairy, those are making up about 70% of the calories that we eat today. And then the stuff that was available 10 to 15,000 years ago, that just makes up the rest. So it's okay. It's just like observational studies, it's really interesting for making hypotheses. It's kind of like an interesting check. But it should not be your go-to thing. Were they doing that if that was right? No. It's were they doing that? Yes. So maybe we can generate this hypothesis and test it. Don't jump to the conclusion that it was right just because they did it. They did plenty of things that I would not recommend. So a lot of the foods that we've been talking about, grains, dairies, and mostly legumes and grains, all of that stuff became widely available during the advent of agriculture. But then again, you've got the potato 7,000 years ago, and really should you eliminate the potato because it was domesticated 7,000 years ago? Give me a break. Something that's interesting, for all the other ones, they're really resistant to predation. They're easily stored. Like one of the reasons why we moved to this stuff is because easily stored, resistant to predation, etc. But you have to ask yourself, why? Why is that? Because they contain all the anti-nutrients, right? That's why they're resistant to predation. That's why they last long. So there's this really interesting paper that just came out, Trends in Food Availability. It was this is published ahead of print, but you can use DOI, means Digital Object Identifier. You can enter this number and quickly get it. It might be published by now, but if you look at it, let's say okay, meat intake has been going up. Yes, that's true. Poultry, whatnot, eggs, dairy products. What am I really interested in? Well, let's look at the fats. Edible tallow, not too surprisingly, given the saturated fat scare, has been going down. Interestingly enough, butter has actually increased. I was surprised to see that. No, it has not. Butter has decreased. Shortening has increased. That's the one that surprised me. But shortening is just these hydrogenated fats, which are bad. And then salads and cooking oils, this is where all your linoleic acid is at. That has increased significantly over time. And so has disease. So there's a correlation there, right? Correlation, not causation. There is a correlation there. Other things, fruit juices and the fructose has obviously increased, and I showed how that has increased over time as well a little earlier. And then caloric sweeteners as well have increased significantly. So again, the correlation is there. It's a useful concept. Polyunsaturated fatty acid consumption has increased as well. So there's a lot of people that are like, well, can eating this way, is that good for health, yes or no? And Cordain, who's like a huge proponent and one of the main individuals to popularize the diet, certainly did not invent it. There's Boyd Eaton and other people that came before him. Essentially puts together this paleo menu, looks at the fat and the carbohydrate breakdown. What you'll find is that the fat is higher than what most of us probably eat, and that the omega-6 and omega-3 ratio is balanced. And then you look at the total percent RDA, and you just beat the RDA on absolutely everything. So you're on this paleo diet, you don't need to supplement anything according to the RDA percentages. You're getting plenty of these vitamins and minerals, with the exception of one, and that's calcium. Calcium is at 69% of the RDA. Why is the RDA on calcium so high? Well, it turns out that the RDA on calcium is so high because people think that we need a lot more calcium because we suffer from a lot of osteoporosis. Well, I did show inflammation was actually responsible and a factor in osteoporosis, and I also showed that all those anti-nutrients, the phytic acid in the grains, was preventing calcium absorption. So the whole calcium thing is not a process of getting more calcium. North Americans get more calcium than anybody else and suffer from osteoporosis more than anybody else. It's not a problem of not getting enough calcium. It's actually a problem of absorption and losing. We're losing too much calcium. Here's something really interesting. Adaptation of Inuit children to a low-calcium diet. So they take these Inuit children and they feed them calcium supplements, and they notice that they immediately get hypercalcemia, like too much calcium in the blood. And you're like, whoa, holy crap, what's happening with these kids? And it's because their calcium absorption is really, really good, because they typically don't get that much from their diet, and they're eating meat and fat, right? Fish and blubber, so they don't have anything that's irritating the gut. Their gut is properly healed and ready for absorption. So that's really interesting. And then there's this article that just came out, Gut Calcium, Welcome to the Calcium Alkali Syndrome. And if you can read really quickly, and you'll find out this guy's like, we're getting more and more people into the emergency room that have these problems that are associated with hypercalcemia. They're getting like way too much calcium. So it's not, osteoporosis is simply not a problem of calcium supplementation. Is a problem of calcium absorption and a problem of calcium loss, and you have to get in there and figure out what the heck is causing that. There's a lot of factors that are involved there. There's vitamin D, vitamin K2, vitamin A, as well as exercise. Exercise is a huge factor. Weight-bearing exercise will increase bone mineralization, like all kinds of stuff like that. So, has this diet ever been tested clinically? And it has. It has been tested specifically under the name of paleo diet, but I would argue that the first time it was tested was in 1930. Most people are familiar with this as the experiment of Stephenson and Anderson. Stephenson was an Arctic explorer, spent a lot of time with the Inuit and Eskimos, and Anderson was a fruit farmer. It's hard to find this thing. It's actually free. If you type this, you'll get the paper and you can read it on the web. It's free. But it's just the title doesn't give you any clue about what it contains. It's called clinical calorimetry. So, prolonged meat diets with a study of kidney function and ketosis. So that actually tells you something, but clinical calorimetry is not quite as telling. So what these people did is live off of an exclusive meat and fat diet for 1 year. And they were monitored in a metabolic ward to see if there were any problems with their health. They had to pee in a pot every day to make sure that they were in ketosis for that whole year. So the protein content of their diet ranged from 100 to 140 grams. the fat from 200 to 300, and the carbohydrate from 7 to 12 grams. This is per day. Where's the carbohydrate coming from? It's coming from muscle glycogen. They're eating, sometimes they eat beef heart too. Beef heart's like a sneaky way to get some muscle glycogen into your diet, or glycogen into your diet. So that's where the glucose is coming from. The caloric values varied from 2,000 to 3,100 calories per day. 15 to 20% of the calories were derived from protein, 75 to 85% from fat, and 1 to 2% from carbohydrate. Breakfast, lean beef, fat. Dinner, liver, fat. Supper, lean beef, bone marrow. Sounds delicious to me, anyways. The meat diet contained about 25% of the amount of calcium found in the average mixed diet, while phosphorus and sulfur were present in larger quantities than usual. Is that a problem? Doesn't have enough calcium in it? No, right? Protein ingestion increases calcium absorption. Did these men adhere strictly to the diet? Absolutely. We can answer in the affirmative with confidence for 3 reasons. First, the subjects were under close observation during a large part of the intensive studies. Second, in every individual specimen of urine, acetone bodies were present in amounts so constant that fluctuations in the carbohydrate intake were practically ruled out. And finally, the high character of the subjects is a guarantee that they faithfully followed the prescribed diet. So, both men were in good physical condition at the end of the observation. There were no subjective or objective evidences of any loss of physical or mental vigor. The teeth showed no deterioration, and gingivitis had disappeared. One of the guys had gingivitis, and it disappeared after he was on this study, even though he wasn't taking any vitamin C or carbohydrate. It turns out that the gingivitis that was observed in the sailors was probably a problem of like excess salt or carbohydrate consumption, and not a problem of excess meat consumption. The body can recycle vitamin C right away. There's a well-known biochemical pathway for that to happen. So, there was, however, an increase in the deposit of tartar on the teeth. Okay. Bowel elimination was undisturbed, and as you'll see shortly, they monitored this very carefully. Required no extra catharsis, and Ka was regular throughout. So the stools were smaller than usual, well-formed, and had an inoffensive, slightly pungent odor. Like I said, they were very detail-oriented. Wouldn't want to be the one doing the study, but hey, whatever. All 3 subjects lost weight during the first week of the diet, probably because of elimination of a lot of glycogen. When you store glycogen, it gets stored with water, so there's a water weight that increases. When you go on a low-carbohydrate diet, you'll initially lose a lot of water weight at the beginning. Hi. Intestinal function. The men were not troubled by constipation more than when eating mixed diets. The diet was small in bulk and well absorbed. In one instance, when the protein was relatively high, diarrhea developed, and that's what I was talking about earlier. If you're going to go like on a zero carb or really low carb, you have to be careful. If the protein gets a little too high, you'll get diarrhea. If the fat gets a little too high, you'll get diarrhea. So it's a tricky thing to balance. There's the people that are going, ugh, I don't want to do that. That's not something that I would recommend, but it can be done. It's something that you probably want to do if you're a zero carb as well as supplement with iodine, unless you're eating a lot of fish. So it turns out that the model population that we have for the zero carb diet are the Eskimos and the Inuit, and they're eating a lot of marine animals. It's fish and seal and whatnot, and whales. So they're getting iodine from marine animal sources. If you go on a really low carbohydrate diet and you're mostly eating cows and land animals, you might become deficient in iodine. So you need to supplement with iodine if you're going to do this. So the effect on the kidneys, I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but you'll see that they examined the urine as well as what's called phenol sulfonophthalate excretion, urea clearance from a class test, as well as blood constituents and size. They found, there's no adverse effects on the kidneys. Again, this whole thing that protein is bad for the kidneys is a myth that just won't die, but it's not true. So summary and conclusions, you can read that on your own, and they were healthier at the beginning of it, at the end of it, and ruddier, and had health problems whatsoever. Here's a direct clinical trial and test of the diet. A Paleolithic diet improves glucose tolerance more than a Mediterranean-like diet in individuals with ischemic heart disease. And this is like touche. They went for the best diet immediately. They're like, yeah, we're going to compare it to the Mediterranean diet because this is the one that's supposed to be ideal. This is the one that's supposed to be optimal. And they're like, our paleo diet is better than that. And you can read this and see the differences in blood glucose, insulin sensitivity, and whatnot. And the paleo diet is better. Again, beneficial effects of a Paleolithic diet on cardiovascular risk factors and type 2 diabetes, a randomized crossover pilot study. Again, the Paleolithic diet is really good. Essentially, these people are reversing diabetes with a Paleolithic diet, which is really impressive. You go talk to a doctor nowadays and you ask them if diabetes can be cured, and they'll say, no, diabetes can't be cured. I'll tell you, yeah, it's pretty easy. Pretty easy to reverse diabetes if you eat properly. Metabolic and physiologic improvements from consuming a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer type diet. This one was done in a metabolic ward where they just locked people up and they fed them. There's 9 people, 3 women, 6 men. The diet is still fairly high in fructose if you do the math, but the outcome is still really good. Like the blood biomarkers of health and everything improves. So this is pretty legitimate stuff. But all of this stuff that we talked about today, whether it's the fructose, it's the linoleic acid, it's the paleo diet, the fat, etc., that doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter because if you ask this registered dietitian here, long periods of fasting, little to no carbs, grueling workouts, it doesn't sound like much fun, and more importantly, is it even healthy? Registered dietitian Al-azdy, spokesperson for the American Dietetic Association, author of Nutrition at Your Fingertips, isn't convinced. I don't think that loading up on high cholesterol meat is a healthful dietary strategy, nor do I support the idea of fasting, especially if it's routine and not medically supervised, she said. It's never a good idea to overemphasize protein or any foods that are high in saturated fat and cholesterol. Oh yeah, those are really bad. What's more, she said, avoiding whole grains and low-fat dairy foods can make a person miss out on key nutrients, including fiber and B vitamins. Essentially, in one phrase, contradicts everything that I have spent my time telling you today, but everything that I told you was very well supported by evidence and references from the primary literature. Here is a registered dietitian who is actually legally allowed to give people dietary advice, and this is what this person has to say. There is little to no science education in registered dietitian degrees, and these people, in my opinion, are morons. They are huge morons. They are completely unable to defend themselves, and I've had discussions with them, and all they do is keep repeating government propaganda louder and louder, hoping that you will eventually go away. And when they say stuff like that to the media, I call it the Harry Potter defense. It's like they wave their magic wand, and all of the pesky scientific evidence that disagrees with their views all of a sudden magically disappears. And this is what we have to face. This is what we have to deal with. With that, I'm done on my rant on the paleo diet. Let's take a quick break, and we'll do some implementation stuff and some more Q&A. And what's going on? Some questions?
Do you want to answer the 5 or 6 questions that came in?
Sure.
Okay, number 1. Are saponins in the skins of sweet potatoes as well?
I don't think there are saponins in the skin of the sweet potatoes, but they do contain oxalic acid and goitrogen. So if the question is like, should I peel my sweet potatoes? I actually peel them.
Okay. Yeah. The differences between raw milk and pasteurized / homogenized
Yeah,
milk.
you should totally. I mean, if you could get raw milk, that would be ideal. So the pasteurization process destroys enzymes that allow you to get more nutrition out of the milk and digest the milk better and whatnot. I just wish that whole myth would go away, that the pasteurization actually protects the bacteria against you and not vice versa. And that's one thing I really wish would go away. So yeah, if the dude has access to raw, totally go that route.
What about acid-base balance? I've heard that.
Oh boy. Listen, I'm a chemist, and I understand what an acid is and a base is. And this whole acid-base balance came out of like the macrobiotic movement, and blood acidosis is real, and it is true that your diet can change the pH of the blood. But recently, the whole potential renal acid load based on the constituents of the diets. I mean, it's like completely wrong. You look at the Inuits, and although some people will tell you otherwise, they did not have osteoporosis. But what really pisses me off, and like I said, bone mineralization is a multivariate problem. It depends on a lot of different things. And this is where over-reliance on this kind of data and the paleo diet can get you into problems. Recently, Lauren Cordain published a paper that is entirely, or is co-author on a paper that is entirely based on the potential renal acid load. Entirely based on the potential renal acid load. And this is the paper. The paper that came out, estimation of the diet-dependent net acid load in 229 worldwide historical studied hunter-gatherer societies. And then here's Cordain's thing. You know, he comments on this paper with Boyd Eaton, diet-dependent acid load, Paleolithic nutrition, and evolutionary health and promotion. And while doing that, he's like, yeah, you know, the only real good paleo diet is like the truly ancestral one that comes from the people that emigrated out of Africa, and they were getting a lot of vegetables and fruits, so their net acid load wasn't necessarily, so they were, you know, basic, essentially had a basic acid load. And then he says, and the Inuit, you know, they were known to, we calculate using the potential renal acid load that their diet was acidic, so they must have had osteoporosis. And he cites this paper saying, yeah, look, it's been proven that they had osteoporosis. And you go read the paper, and there is no evidence in there that shows that the Inuit had osteoporosis. Like, he's just like convinced that he's right, that this potential renal acid load is like really the key, the end-all, be-all to bone mineralization and osteoporosis. And he says, yeah, okay, this has to be the case. And you go read, here's like a few of the things that are in this paper. The data in Table 1 and 3 indicate that the Saddler-Meat Eskimo are intermediate in midshaft densities to the American white and American Negro males and are similar to limbs males. The Eskimo do not differ significantly from these groups. However, their midshaft sections are significantly denser than those of the American white and American Negro females, and are also significantly denser than those of both the Quechua males and females. The results for the radius head differ from, blah, blah, blah. And you read the actual paper that he quotes, and it's just not true. They did not have osteoporosis. So this potential renal acid load is completely man-made. I would like someone to give me like the hardcore biochemistry that's going on. So that, their contention is that, everything that you eat has to make its way to the kidneys, and the kidney's going to decide whether it's basic or acidic. And if it's acidic, it has to be neutralized by calcium phosphate that comes from bone, and that's going to make you lose calcium, and that's going to that's going to give you osteoporosis. But I said that protein ingestion, protein is acidic, but it increases calcium absorption. So there are other mechanisms that are making up for this stuff. So I think it's just hogwash, and I freaking hate it. I don't lecture on it because I think it's pseudoscience and it's crap. So that's my take on that. I really hate that stuff. That's my take on the potential renal acid load.
Okay, Matt Birkin of Lean Gains recommends supplementing with calcium citrate if you are on the paleo diet because it can increase levels of free testosterone. Can you comment?
I think that if you're doing like a really legit, a tight paleo diet, you're like meat, vegetables, limiting nuts and seeds, plenty of tubers and other things like that, you don't need calcium supplementation. You just don't need that. And then there's more. Did he say testosterone or growth hormone? Yeah, there's more, again, to testosterone levels than just like your calcium levels. So I tend to be on the minimalist side as far as supplements are concerned. I would say, no, I don't think it's necessary. Like, you want to increase your testosterone levels, stop smoking, stop drinking, stop eating soy, get plenty of sleep, lift heavy stuff, you're going to increase your testosterone levels.
And then finally, is there a source of iodine in carbohydrates?
Yeah, kelp. Kelp and sea vegetables. Great source of iodine. And it's like kelp is just a seaweed. It's actually pretty low in carbohydrates, mostly fiber, and there's plenty of iodine in kelp. So yeah, that's a good source. I actually take an iodine supplement just to be sure, and it is kelp. You can have kelp noodles, by the way, for those of you that miss noodles on a paleo diet. Are we done with the questions? Okay, so let's take a quick break.